Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're heading to medieval Sri Lanka.
Sounds exciting.
It is. We're going to be looking at Alastair Gornall's book, Rewriting Buddhism, and, maybe uncovering some stuff about Sri Lankan history that people don't really think about.
Yeah, Gornall really challenges those typical views, of this period being super isolated or just like a carbon copy of Indian Buddhism.
Right, exactly. It's not just about, monks chilling in monasteries. It's a lot more dynamic.
Way more. One of the things Gornall tackles is this idea of the Pali Imaginaire.
The Pali Imaginaire.
Uh,
Okay, what's that all about?
It's this concept that basically the mental world that's created by these Buddhist Pali texts. It's like the main driving force behind everything.
So, like, these texts kind of provided a worldview for people.
Yeah, exactly. Like a framework for understanding the world.
Okay, but Gornall's saying it's not that simple.
Right, like he's arguing that these texts weren't just, reflecting society. They were tools that people were actively using.
Duels, what do you mean?
People used these texts to make sense of what was happening around them and to actually change things.
I see. So they were like these active forces shaping society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For instance, think about the kings in Sri Lanka. They started claiming they were descended from this Okaka lineage.
The Okaka lineage. Who are they?
It's the Buddhist family.
Whoa! So the kings are saying they're related to the Buddha.
Yeah, and it wasn't just, some random genealogy thing. They were trying to connect their authority directly to Buddhism.
Ah, clever. Like a religious PR move to solidify their power.
Exactly. And this connection to Buddhism, it really influenced everything, even the structure of the government.
Okay, how so?
Well, think about compound kingship. It's a system where power was like this blend of divine, right from the gods, and human authority.
So it's not just one king calling all the shots.
Nope. Power was spread out among a whole bunch of rulers. Yeah. So it wasn't just a simple case of, king versus monks. It was way more complicated than that.
Sounds like a recipe for some interesting power dynamics.
Oh, absolutely. Especially in the 12th century.
Why the 12th century? What was going on then?
That's when you had all these different factions in Sri Lanka vying for control. It was like their own Game of Thrones.
Whoa! So amidst all this chaos, who comes out on top?
This guy named Parakramabahu.
Parakramabahu. He's kind of a big deal, right?
Oh, yeah. Huge figure. He was super skilled at navigating all this political turmoil. He wasn't just winning battles. He was also using religious arguments to justify his rise to power.
So he was a warrior and a politician.
You got it. And he was very successful. He ended up consolidating the kingdom and brought some stability to the whole region.
Wow. That's impressive. But how did all this political drama affect how people were understanding Buddhism at the time?
It had a huge impact. Imagine you're living in this world where everything feels like it's falling apart politically. People started to see this as a sign that the Dharma, the Buddhist teachings, were in decline.
Oh, wow. Like an end times vibe. That would definitely make you rethink things.
For sure. And one of the ways they responded was by shifting their focus to this idea of the bodhisattva ideal.
The bodhisattva ideal. Okay, what's that all about?
So it's not just about, seeking personal enlightenment anymore. It's about dedicating yourself to helping everyone reach that goal.
So it's less about me finding peace and more about let's all achieve enlightenment together.
Right, it's a big shift.
That's pretty radical. How did this change the way people practiced their faith?
Well, instead of monks just meditating in caves, they were encouraged to be more engaged with the world.
Like get out there and do good deeds.
Exactly. Earning merit through actions. Even that, like sweeping a shrine became a really powerful act of devotion.
Wow. So even everyday chores could have spiritual meaning.
Absolutely. Everything could be a step on the path to enlightenment. But this is just one part of what was happening. You also had this huge influx of Sanskrit learning during this period.
Sanskrit? But aren't the Buddhist scriptures in Pali? Why were they so into Sanskrit?
Well, it was thanks to people like Ratnamati.
Ratnamati, who was he?
He was this scholar monk, a total master of Sanskrit grammar and poetry.
So they were bringing in these new ideas and perspectives from the Sanskrit tradition.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about, fancy courtly literature.
What else was it about?
It opened the door to engaging with other forms of Buddhism.
Oh, really? Like what?
Even things like Mahayana and Tantric texts.
Tantric Buddhism in Sri Lanka. That's not something you hear about every day.
I know, right? It shows just how dynamic and open Sri Lankan Buddhism really was.
So they're exploring all these new ideas from Sanskrit. But what about their core texts, the Pali ones? How did they make sure those were being understood properly?
Well, they had this deep-rooted respect for these teachings. They wanted to ensure that the meaning was preserved. you know.
So how did they do that?
They really dove deep into Pali grammar.
Grammar, like sentence diagramming and stuff.
Kind of, but it was more about unlocking the precise meaning of these texts.
Mm.
Ensuring that the essence of the teachings wasn't left in translation.
So grammar was like this key to understanding their entire belief system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was a way to protect their religious and cultural heritage. And this was especially important with all the changes happening around them. They wanted to make sure that the core of their faith remained strong.
I can see that. It's like in times of uncertainty, you hold on to what's most important.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And for them, that was the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha.
This is already so fascinating. We've got political intrigue, new interpretations of Buddhism, a deep dive into grammar. It's amazing how it all comes together.
It really does. It paints this picture of Sri Lankan Buddhism that's far more complex and interesting than maybe people typically think.
Absolutely. And we've barely scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore.
Yeah, it's like all these different forces are shaping Buddhism at the same time.
It's like a puzzle with all these pieces fitting together.
Right. And this idea of the texts as relics, it really shows you how much importance they placed on these writings. It wasn't just the words, it was the books themselves.
So how did that, actually play out? Did it change how they made these texts or how they were shared?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Monasteries became like these major centers for copying and preserving scriptures. They were like these ancient printing houses.
I can imagine those monks hunched over their manuscripts, carefully copying each word.
Yeah, and they also wanted to make these complex teachings more accessible to people. So they started creating all these anthologies and handbooks.
Anthologies and handbooks. Sounds kind of like Buddhism for beginners.
Yeah, kind of. They were compiling all these bits and pieces from different commentaries and texts. Often they would organize them by theme or practice.
So they were making it easier for people to understand, all these different aspects of Buddhism.
Exactly. Like imagine trying to navigate all those complex ideas without a guidebook.
Yeah, it would be like trying to learn a new language without a dictionary.
Right. So these anthologies and handbooks, they were really important tools for both teachers and students.
Do we know what kind of stuff was in these anthologies?
Yeah, we do. There's this famous one called the Sarasagaha by Siddhartha. He was a scholar monk from the 13th century.
Sarasagaha.
Okay.
And what's it all about?
It covers a huge range of topics.
Yeah.
Like the nature of the Buddha, his teachings, the dangers of false views, the benefits of doing good deeds. It even gets into cosmology, like the structure of the universe and all the different realms of existence.
Whoa, that's a lot to pack into one book.
It is. There's like a one-stop shop for all things Buddhism.
So they would use this for teaching in the monasteries.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It helped break down all those core principles into something a little easier to grasp. You can picture all these young monks studying it, trying to absorb all this wisdom.
That's incredible. So we've got politics, we've got these anxieties about the end of the Dharma, new ideas coming in from India, and these efforts to make Buddhism more accessible. It's really fascinating to see how it all comes together.
It is. It really highlights the dynamism of Sri Lankan Buddhism during this period.
And it makes you wonder, did all this just stay within Sri Lanka, or did these developments spread further?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that Sri Lanka wasn't isolated. They had tons of connections with other Buddhist communities, especially in mainland Southeast Asia.
So places like Burma or Thailand.
Exactly. Sri Lankan monks traveled all over the region, taking their texts and practices with them.
So did these ideas about scriptures as relics and the bodhisattva ideal, did they catch on in those places too?
They did. We see similar trends popping up in those countries around the same time.
So Sri Lanka was kind of like this hub of Buddhist innovation.
You could say that. It's like their ideas and practices had this ripple effect across the whole region.
That's amazing. It really shows you how interconnected the Buddhist world was back then.
Yeah, and language played a huge role in all of this. We've been talking about Pali and Sanskrit, but what about Sinhala? The language that most people in Sri Lanka actually spoke.
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? You get these different languages, each serving a different purpose. Pali and Sanskrit, they were like the languages of scholarship.
Yeah.
But Sinhala was the language of everyday life. It's what they used for preaching and writing devotional literature.
So they were using different languages to reach different audiences?
Exactly. Like imagine hearing those teachings in your own language. It would have been so much more powerful.
Yeah, definitely. It's like they had this whole language ecosystem for spreading Buddhist thought.
Exactly. And it shows just how adaptable Sri Lankan Buddhism was. They weren't afraid to use whatever tools they had to make those teachings resonate with people.
So we've got all these different threads coming together: politics, philosophy, language, cultural exchange. It's really quite a tapestry.
It is. It's like all these things are woven together to create this rich and dynamic culture.
And it's a culture that's clearly deeply engaged with ideas and knowledge. We've talked about all these scholar monks and their writings. But I'm curious, you mentioned that Ratnamati was also a master of poetics. What exactly does that mean?
Poetics. It's basically the art of understanding poetry. All those things like meter, rhyme, figures of speech.
So it's not just about writing poetry, it's about analyzing it.
Yeah, exactly. They would dissect these poems, study them, try to figure out how language creates beauty and meaning. It was like a science almost.
A science of poetry, that's pretty cool. But how did Ratnamati's expertise in Sanskrit poetics influence Sri Lankan Buddhism? Did they start writing Buddhist poetry in Sanskrit?
It wasn't about switching languages. It was about bringing a fresh perspective. Ratnamati's work inspired a whole new generation of scholar monks, and they started incorporating these Sanskrit poetic techniques into their Pali writings.
So they were taking these tools from one tradition and applying them to another. That's fascinating. What kind of impact did that have on Buddhist literature?
It led to this amazing flowering of Pali Buddhist poetry. It became way more ornate and sophisticated than before.
So it wasn't just about conveying information anymore.
Right. It was about using language to create an experience, to evoke emotions and inspire devotion.
So it's like they were realizing the power of art to express religious truths.
Exactly. They understood that beauty could be a pathway to understanding. And it wasn't just about aesthetics. They had deeper reasons for bringing poetics into Buddhism.
Okay, what were those reasons?
Remember how we talked about that growing emphasis on cultivating positive emotions and transforming the mind?
Yeah, I remember.
They believed that poetry, with its ability to, stir up emotions, could actually be a tool for spiritual growth.
So it's not just about making things sound nice, it's about using language to actually cultivate specific states of mind.
Exactly. And they were really interested in this one particular emotion called pasada.
Pasada, what's that?
It's often translated as like serene joy or clarity. Imagine a feeling of deep peace and inspiration. The kind of calmness you feel when you contemplate the beauty of the Dharma or the qualities of the Buddha.
It sounds like that feeling you get when you listen to beautiful music or stand in awe of nature.
Yeah, exactly. And these Buddhist poets believed that they could use language to evoke that same feeling in their readers.
So they're composing these poems that are designed to awaken the soul.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It's like they were using poetry as this bridge between the intellect and the heart.
That's amazing. But was this just an elite thing for, scholars to ponder? Or did they try to share these ideas with a wider audience?
Oh, they definitely tried to share it. One of the ways they did that was by writing more Buddhist literature in Sinhala, the language of the people.
So they were bringing these complex ideas down to a level that everyone could understand.
Right. And they were using poetic forms that were accessible and engaging so that everyone could experience the beauty and wisdom of the teachings.
It's like they were creating this bridge between the world of scholarship and the lives of everyday people.
Exactly. They wanted everyone to be able to connect with the Dharma on a deeper level, to feel its transformative power.
It's so inspiring to see how committed they were to sharing their knowledge.
It is. It reminds us that knowledge is at its most valuable when it's shared and used to make a positive impact on the world.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. It's amazing to see how all these pieces fit together. The politics, the philosophy, the language, the art. It all comes together to paint this incredibly vibrant picture of Sri Lankan Buddhism.
It does. Gornall's book really opens our eyes to a side of history that we might not know much about.
And it challenges us to rethink some of our assumptions about Buddhism and its development.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something we touched on earlier, this idea of treaty scriptures as relics. It's such a fascinating concept, and it really seems to get at the heart of how Sri Lankans viewed these texts.
Yeah, it really is. It kind of takes that Pali imaginaire we were talking about to a whole other level. Instead of just the words being important, it's like the physical book itself becomes this sacred object.
It's like the book becomes a relic in itself.
Right. And I think that really resonated with people, especially during a time when there was so much change and uncertainty.
Yeah, that makes sense. If the world around you feels like it's falling apart, it's comforting to have something solid, something tangible to hold on to. Exactly. And what's more solid and enduring than a book that contains the words of the Buddha?
Right. It's like a direct link to the source of wisdom and truth.
Exactly. So you can see why these book relics became so important to people.
Okay, so how did this practice actually work? I mean, did they build like special shrines for these books?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They would enshrine these texts in these elaborate reliquaries. Sometimes they would even put them alongside physical relics of the Buddha.
So like these ornate caskets and stuff.
Exactly, often decorated with precious metals and jewels. It was a real testament to how much they valued these scriptures.
Wow, that's amazing. And I bet there were all sorts of rituals and ceremonies associated with these book relics.
Oh, yeah, for sure. You'd have processions, offerings, chanting, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
It was a way for people to publicly demonstrate their devotion to the Dharma.
So it wasn't just a private, personal thing.
Not at all. It was a very public, communal expression of faith.
It's incredible to think about, you know, all those ideas we've been talking about coming together in this very real, very visual way.
I know, right? It shows you how religion isn't just about beliefs, it's about practice. It's about rituals and objects and experiences.
And it's about community, too.
Exactly. It's about coming together to share those experiences and to reaffirm those beliefs. But, these book relics weren't just spiritual objects. They also played a really important role in Sri Lankan society.
Really? In what way?
Well, for one thing, they were incredibly valuable. Monasteries that housed these book relics, they gained a lot of prestige and influence.
Like having a book relic was a status symbol.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And they attracted tons of pilgrims and donations. Remember those debates we talked about regarding the economic value of offerings made to scriptures?
Yeah, I remember.
Well, that wasn't just some theoretical argument. It had real implications for the wealth and power of these institutions.
So these book relics were kind of like these spiritual and economic powerhouses.
Exactly. It's a great example of how these different aspects of life, the religious, the political, the economic, they were all intertwined.
That's fascinating. It really makes you think about the complex roles that objects can play in society.
It does. And it speaks to the ingenuity of Sri Lankan Buddhism.
Yeah.
They found a way to express this core belief, the power of the Dharma, in a way that really resonated with their culture, their political system, their whole way of life.
It's a great reminder that even these ancient traditions, they're constantly evolving, finding new ways to make those timeless truths relevant.
That's so true. I think that's one of the big takeaways from Gornall's book. We often have this idea that Buddhism is this unchanging monolithic thing, but it's not. It's dynamic and it's adaptable and it's constantly finding new ways to express itself.
Absolutely. And I think this deep dive has really shown us that we've seen how Sri Lankan Buddhism was shaped by so many different forces, politics, social anxieties, intellectual exchange, and even artistic innovation. It's really been an eye-opening journey.
I agree. It's a great reminder that there's always more to learn about the world and about ourselves, and that sometimes the most fascinating discoveries are found in the most unexpected places.
Well said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. So to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of medieval Sri Lankan Buddhism. We hope you've enjoyed the journey as much as we have.